All right, so in this video, we're going to be going over the evolution of evolutionary thought, which I know can be a really dry topic for a lot of people, but it's important to go over. So a lot of people make this misconception that evolution was just Darwin. And Darwin, yes, had a huge influence on evolution as we know it now, but there were a lot of individuals that helped shape our kind of thought of evolution, really created the foundations of modern evolutionary thought that are equally as important as Darwin and kind of need to be considered. So that's what we're going to go over in this lecture. Again, I have to give a disclaimer in case you hear any purring. That would be Figaro. He is right next to the computer sleeping, and he's very happy, so you might also hear him snoring. So I apologize if you hear any of that. I also apologize for the air conditioning in the background, but I don't want to get up and disturb Figaro, and it also is grossly hot outside, so I don't feel like melting today. Anyway, let's get started. Prior to the 19th century, even before 6th or 7th century BCE, well before Darwin, we're talking years before Darwin, the dominant view that held was creationism. And it was really this early creationist view that provided the only answers mankind had for the grand question as to our existence or our being. That traditional Judeo-Christian version of creationism, that's really what existed at that point in time, maintained that there were special and individual creation events for each species, and that life forms did not change through time across generations. And it was kind of feeding what we call this typological thought. Essentially, everything is fit into a specific individual box. So cats are cats, all dogs are dogs, and all horses are horses. Essentially, it didn't consider variation, or it said that variation was not important to the gods. Any variation within the groups or your taxa, they were just small and not of consequence. So it's not surprising with those kind of strong ideas that really the only kind of advancements in biology per se that were made pre-19th century were just descriptions of plants and animals as they were. There was no attempt to explain how they got to that or got to where they are at that moment in time. There's also a belief that the Earth was very young, only about 6,000 years old. Now, the actual idea of evolution, the idea that species change over time, that didn't really come, or I should say that originated with the Greeks back in the 6th century, particularly with this Greek philosopher named Anaximander. Anaximander was a student of Thales, and he kept a lot of Thales' teachings, and then expanded upon and added to those teachings by implementing his own imagination. Anaximander believed that everything in the universe was contained in something called the indefinite. And the indefinite was it was limitless, it was external and unobservable. And he believed that the universe was in a state of chaos from which species originally arose. His main kind of idea that actually had evolutionary bearing, I believe, was this idea that mankind arose from aquatic organisms. So they arose from these water-dwelling species. And Anaximander argued these were specifically fish. And his whole kind of argument behind this thought was that if humans existed originally on Earth as human beings, considering the amount of fostering care that they need for such long periods of time, they would not have been able to maintain their existence. So they must have originated as something that could have lived well in that high moisture environment. So he proposed fish. And then through time, through a series of transmutations, as fish kind of grew out of moisture and we grew into warmth, we became humans. It was really this idea from Anaximander that initiated a philosophical movement to explain the world according to the fixed laws of nature rather than the operation of the divinities. We often refer to this as methodological naturalism. In other words, it provides a procedure for scientific examination and seeks to explain things using natural laws rather than the supernatural. So these are two other familiar characters, or they should be for you. Plato and Aristotle also laid the foundations for early, kind of the early natural origins of thought. A little different perspectives than Anaximander. They laid these foundations with their idealistic views that species were in the search for perfection. We'll start with Plato. So he was this philosopher that believed every organism was an example of a perfect essence or type by God or created by God, and that these types were unchanging. To him, the structure and form of a species could be well understood by their function, and that function was predetermined by an external force in an effort to maintain goodness and harmony. Now, Plato acknowledged that there could be imperfections with some organisms, with some individuals, but he said that these were just reflections of the physical world and were to be ignored. God bless you, Figaro. And were to be ignored. The key to understanding life based on Plato's view was to ignore these variations and instead focus on the unchanging, perfect essence. Now, Aristotle, he was one of Plato's favorite students. Aristotle loved animals. He was a prolific writer. And whereas Plato focused more on the purpose of different organisms, Aristotle was more interested in explaining the transitions that organisms went through to reach perfection. Aristotle viewed the universe as being external, and he thought that it was created or composed of different distinct forms of being, and that all organisms, God bless you again, Figaro, and all organisms were ordered in this hierarchy based on their size and complexity. And this hierarchy, you can think of it almost as the ladder of life, was called the Great Chain of Being. Now, the Great Chain of Being, again, it was this linear scheme in which organisms were ordered from at the lowest level, being the bare minimum, all the way to ultimate perfection, or ans perfectissimum. And that was the divinities, that was God, was the ultimate perfection. So at this lower level here, you have the lifeless. So this would be your minerals, everything that's actually, this is hell here. Then you have your minerals, everything that's inorganic. Right above that, the next transition or the next rung in the ladder are plants, or your vegetative states. And those were still in the realm of becoming. So what was he considered lifeless in the transition stages to becoming more and more perfect. But plants were had a little bit more life than minerals. And then above the vegetation, you had animals. And then the first kind of tier in perfection, or the realm of being, was mankind. And then from there, you had demons, angels, and then ultimate perfection was God. So essentially, this was this whole ladder of different transitions to, oh God, no, you're not getting your squeaky toy. I'm sorry. This whole ladder of transitions from simple and undeveloped all the way to complexity and perfection. And each stage was a transition and becoming slightly more and more complex in an effort to assimilate itself being the organism, to ultimate perfection. So in reality, it was just this kind of transition from lower to higher, again, in an effort to become more and more perfect or reach that peak ultimate perfection. Now, this hierarchy that Aristotle created was co-opted by classical theologians in the Middle Ages and really carried through well into the Renaissance period. Throughout the classical medieval time period, you had a lot of these early thoughts carry through. So you had the continuation of this thought about fixity of species, wherein you have variation and heredity occurring only within the boundaries of a species. Again, there was this belief that species really didn't go through any change since the day of their original creation, and that if there was variation, it was so small and insignificant that it should go ignored. The gods didn't really care about it. God bless you, Figaro. There was also this idea or this concept that we call heterogenesis. And heterogenesis is the idea that the parents of one organism or one species could give rise to the offspring of another species. So at this time, they thought that composite species were created by breeding wildly different species together. So, for example, they thought that giraffes were created by breeding a leopard with a camel. So, really abstract thought. And all of these kind of early mechanisms or proposed mechanisms relied on the concept of spontaneous generation. And that's the idea that complex life forms arose repeatedly without external stimuli from non-living matter. So, for example, meat could produce maggots, and mud would produce fish or mud puppies, and a barrel of grain could produce mice. And that lasted for quite a while. It wasn't really until 1700 that things started to change. You had your next kind of big movement in this whole evolution of evolutionary thought. And that came with this guy, Carolus Linnaeus, or Carl Linnaeus, who was a Swedish naturalist. And he was a brilliant individual. He was a botanist, a physician, and a zoologist. So he really had this diverse, expansive knowledge of science and a really well-rounded view of the natural world. And he's considered the father of taxonomy. So taxonomy is the part of science that focuses on naming and classifying or grouping different organisms based on certain similarities. So in the 1700s, he developed a way to name and organize species that we actually still use today, which is pretty incredible. So his two most important contributions to the field of taxonomy are one, a hierarchical classification system, more commonly known as the Linnaean classification scheme or Linnaean taxonomy, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then the second was the system of binomial nomenclature, which is a two-part naming method that we use to give organisms their scientific name. So with this method, there's two parts to the name. Both parts are italicized. Now, the first part begins with a capital letter, and that name is referring to the genus. A genus is a collection of species that are very similar. The second part of the name is all in lowercase, and that's referring to the actual species. So a species is a group of individuals that are capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. And a lot of times the species part of the name also refers to some sort of particular trait or a geographical location. For example, take the name Panthera tigris, which is the scientific name for the tiger. In Linnaean taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus originally gave it the scientific name Felis tigris. Felis referring to Felidae, which was the name for cats. The name tigris, that species name, derives from the ancient Greek word for tiger, but it also refers to where tigers were found. They were found along the Tigris River. So that's just an interesting example for a species name. Now, during his lifetime, I think this is incredible. Linnaeus collected something like more than 40,000 different plant, animal, and shell species. And using his binomial nomenclature system alone, he was able to name and classify, I think it was like 7,700 plants and 4,400 animal species, which is, I think it's just fascinating. So this guy was great. So this was his kind of the bare bones of his classification system. In the Linnaean classification system, all organisms were grouped into the broadest category, which were kingdoms, and there are 3 kingdoms in which they could fall into. All plants belong to the kingdom Plantae, all animals belong to Animalia, and then in Linnaean classification, non-living entities were classified. So there was a kingdom for minerals. And then your kingdoms, from there they were classified into class, and then order, genus, and then species. So we use very similar classification scheme, but we've added a few little components or levels to the hierarchy. So in our modern classification system, we have a broader category above kingdom, and that's called domain. So all life forms are classified into one of 3 domains. That's bacteria, archaeobacteria, and eukarya. And then from there, they're broken down into 6 kingdoms. So in domain bacteria, you have kingdom bacteria. In domain archaeobacteria, you have kingdom archaeobacteria. And then, domain archaea, you have archaeobacteria. And then in domain eukarya, you have the kingdoms Animalia, fungi, plantae, and protista. And then from there, they're broken down or classified into phylum, and then class, order, family, genus, and species. So phylum and family were also added to the Linnaean classification. Furthermore, our current classification system does not classify non-living objects. It's just for living things. So here's just an example using Linnaean taxonomy and then showing the addition of our modern day kind of additions to taxonomy. So while, Figaro, stop rubbing against my computer. So while at the same time that these radical thinkers were discussing the transmutation or evolution of species, geologists like William Smith were beginning to map the rocks and fossils of Great Britain. And what Smith and some of these other geologists were able to show was that rocks were laid down in a certain order, and that different fossils in different layers lived or existed at different intervals in the geologic kind of timetable. So this was clear evidence that different species had existed in the past than what were in existence at that time. However, Smith did not go on to ask the question of why or how, or consider that this might even be evidence for evolution. So he made some great discoveries, but he didn't employ them in a way that at that time could have influenced evolutionary thought. It wasn't until later where things began to change. So even with those discoveries, the dominant view for kind of Earth's features, or how different Earth features came to be, was held in this dominant view of catastrophism. So catastrophism, again, was brought in pre-19th century, really pushed by a man named Cuvier. And the whole idea proposed that all landforms were created by catastrophic events. These are things like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, and each of those events were instantaneous. So mountains were formed instantly. Canyons were created instantly. It was like a quick moment in time that these things were able to form. And that view held for a while. It wasn't really challenged or opposed until the late 1700s. There were two individuals who really countered that view. The first was James Hutton in 1795, and then the second was Charles Lyell in 1833. So we'll start with James Hutton. He was a Scottish scientist and physician who published a set of theories explaining the geology of the Earth. Among them were the concepts of geologic time, and that the Earth gradually changes over time. And Hutton argued that all of this geologic evidence, so the different rock strata, which form these kind of unconformities, as we call them, those different layers of the rock strata, and how they were aligned, the processes of erosion and sedimentation, and just the fossil data alone, all of that suggested the Earth was inconceivably old. And he started pushing this concept known as gradualism. And gradualism is the idea that changes on Earth occurred in small steps over long periods of time. So, in other words, these were basically Earth features were the cumulative products of slow but continuous processes. So example, what I have here in the background, the Grand Canyons, the canyons carved by rivers. He said they showed gradual change. Lyell built upon Hutton's ideas. He aimed to explain Earth's geologic features by appealing to the same geological processes that were currently observable. And he argued that these same processes have operated over very, very long periods of time in a slow, gradual manner, and that they were still present and occurring at that time. So they were still occurring today, and they would, oh, Figaro, and they would add up to cause great change. Go over there. In 1833, he published his second edition of Principles of Geology, wherein he pushed this view that's known as uniformitarian. So uniformitarianism is the theory that changes in the Earth's crust during geologic history have resulted from continuous and uniform processes, and that these processes continue to operate today as they did in the past. And for Lyell, he said that this was really important. That component was really important because we could then use the forces that were present today to infer things about the past. So that was what was going on in kind of the whole realm of geology at that immediate pre-19th century. Moving from geology back into our living organisms, the whole concept of changes in species was brought back into scientific discourse in 1809, by a man named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. Lamarck was a French naturalist who truly established the first theory of evolution. Lamarck rejected the idea that species or new species suddenly appeared, whether it was from some mass extinction event or because of a catastrophic event. He said that, or he argued that they instead changed over time. So again, he kind of goes back to this idea of transmutations that really were introduced by Anaximander. Lamarck proposed that new, more complex species developed gradually from older, less complex species. And again, this was a very gradual process. And he kind of outlined a pivotal mechanism for evolution, something that is called or known as the inheritance of acquired traits. Now, the basis of this idea is that during the lifetime of an organism, the habits and behavior of that organism will bring about structural changes. And those structural changes could then be passed down through generations by different offspring. And the whole idea was hinged on what Lamarck coined as the use and disuse theory. Essentially, structures that were not used would shrivel up and disappear. So it's kind of this use it or lose it kind of approach. So Lamarck was great because he proposed a mechanism for evolutionary change. Proposing that method, that was really his legacy. Unfortunately, he postulated the wrong mechanism at which evolution occurs. That's where he fell a little bit short. So in Lamarck's mechanism of evolution, he thought that an animal could acquire a characteristic, and that through use or disuse, and then that characteristic could be passed on to offspring and then passed down through generations, which is something we know now is not true. But Lamarck's favorite example were giraffes. So he believed and argued that giraffes got their long neck from generations of straining their necks to reach the higher branches on tall trees, and generations of stretching their neck that caused a structural characteristic of this stretched neck that was then passed on to their offspring. And again, that's not really quite how it actually happens. And the reason, so why Lamarck's mechanism is wrong is because it hinges on what is today a common misconception that a need produces a heritable evolutionary change, which is not true. So in Lamarck's mechanism, you start off with an environmental change, and that environmental change then creates a new need to meet the demands of the changed environment. And then that need alters metabolism. So it causes change in internal physiology. And then that triggers the appearance of new structures to meet those new demands. And then those new structures can be passed on to offspring. So that's kind of how his mechanism works. We know now it's not true, but again, this was kind of the first established theory for how evolution operated. Figaro, what are you doing? Yeah. All right, so this should be a familiar name, Thomas Malthus, and you're probably wondering, okay, what the heck does he have to do with evolution? Well, he was an English political economist who did a lot of work with population studies. The reason why he is brought into our conversation on the evolution of evolutionary thought is, Figaro, you can't step on my computer, is because he proposed theories that later had bearings or played a role in the foundations of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So, oh, Figaro, I'm sorry. So that's why we talk about Malthus. So Malthus in 1798 published the first edition of what was called an essay on the principles of populations. And in that essay, he argued that human populations would continue to grow and eventually outstrip current food supply. And that would lead to population growth that would be checked by such events as famine or war and disease. So what he actually created was something called, we refer to now as the Malthusian population theory. So in this theory, populations, if humans were able to survive and continue to reproduce, that population would increase exponentially. So according to Malthusian theory, human population growth was occurring geometrically. So there's geometric growth here, whereas your food resources and food supply was following more of a linear growth. And the reason why that line does have an increase, why it's not a straight line with no growth, is because he was taking into consideration that we had food production at that time. So the point at which those two lines cross was something, or was an event called or considered the Malthusian catastrophe. And at that point, that's when human populations would surpass the resources available. So they would outstrip food supply and resources, and that would lead to war, famine, and disease. Basically, products of overpopulation according to natural law. All right, so now we talk about Darwin. Yay, Darwin. Darwin. Okay, so in the early 19th century, Charles Darwin kind of rekindled these ideas about evolution. And you could say that evolution was always in his blood. If you look back, his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was one of the few supporters of Lamarck's ideas on the changes of species, and that species actually changed over time. And there were only a few radical thinkers that followed that train of thought. So I always say it was in his blood because of his grandfather. From 1831 to 1836, Darwin toured the world on the HMS Beagle as a very young naturalist, and it was kind of by a stroke of luck that he was able to get on that ship. That's a long backstory that I won't bore you with. But on his trip, he was dazzled by the amazing diversity of life, and he found these, especially what he found in the Galapagos Islands. That's where a lot of his discoveries kind of were formed. But he was amazed by some of the fossils that he found. There were some that were rodents the size of hippopotamuses. And this whole time he started to wonder where it might have all originated. Now, the actual pieces of this jigsaw puzzle didn't start to fit together in his mind until he was on his return trip home from the journey on the Beagle. Around 1842, he read the essay that Malthus had published. And in that essay, Malthus writes that human populations would grow and would eventually surpass food supply, and at that point you would have intense competition, and only the fit and best adapted would be able to survive. And Darwin read this and thought to himself, well, this kind of can be applied to all of life. So I'm going to put you kind of in his insight at that moment. So to Darwin, or Darwin's thought was that other animals' populations might also be kept low or limited by the struggle for existence, and in which only the best adapted would survive. So he kind of took on, you want to kind of apply this to the Malthusian population graph. You had the exponential growth of plants and animals. You know what, I'm actually just going to go back to that graph. So plants and animal species followed the same geometric population growth. And then for Darwin, food supply, it didn't follow a linear increase. So food supply in nature was kept at a constant level. Oh, I can actually draw. So let's see, I want blue. So food supply in nature instead followed a straight, stable line because there's no food production there, or I should say no mass artificial food production. And then this kind of shaded area that, let me erase that shaded area above the point of intersection, that reflects the zone in which natural selection by resource limitation occurs. And it's at that point where, or in that zone, where those organisms that were least fit would not survive. So that's kind of how this whole Darwin's whole insight was applied to Malthusian theory, and from that application he came up with what we now refer to as, hey, why can't I get out of this? Let's see here. What do I click on? No, I don't want that. Okay, sorry, I'm technologically tech idiot. Okay, there we go. This whole theory of natural selection as we know it. And an important concept is that he hypothesized that in his theory of natural selection, that the environment selects on variation within traits of individual organisms, because some variants were more successful than others at increasing their probability of survival and reproduction. Now, according to Darwin, survival was or represented an organism's responsiveness to change, or its ability to adapt in the face of change. So we'll go over natural selection a little more in a future lecture. But in general, he came up with these 5 major theories. So first was just evolution as such. So evolution, exactly what it is. It's change over time of species that leads to continuous diversity. He had the theory of common descent, so this theory of a last universal common ancestor from which all life stemmed from. The theory of variation and natural selection, population thinking, allopatric speciation, and lastly, gradualness. So everything occurs gradually. It's slow changes over time, and it's a continuous process. So this guy, Alfred Wallace, he's sometimes left out of things, but he had very similar ideas as Darwin in reference to evolution by means of natural selection. And apparently Wallace came to this idea while he had a fever from malaria. So he wrote up his idea and quickly mailed it in a manuscript to Darwin. And the title of it was On the Tendency of Variations to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Types, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, Darwin gets this and quickly invites Wallace to have their theories co-presented in 1858 by Lyell and Hooker before the Linnaean Society of London. And then right after that, Darwin quickly published his book in 1859 on the origin of species. Now, Darwin's concept of evolution by natural selection was not met with the happiest of thoughts. It was met with a lot of controversy and debate. Although at that time there were some Christians who were beginning to accept evolution, there were a lot who were opposed to the idea that evolution operated on random competition and natural laws. But again, there were some leading scientists who supported evolution. One of these individuals being Thomas Henry Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog because of his furious or ferocious, is a better word, ferocious support of Darwin. On June 30th, 1860, Huxley debated evolution with Bishop Wilberforce. And they did this at the British Association meeting in Oxford. And in the debate, Wilberforce infamously inquired of Huxley whether it was through his grandfather or grandmother that he claimed descent from a monkey. And then Huxley rose to the defense of evolution, finishing his speech with this legendary line that really put down Wilberforce. So it was a really heated debate, but it was from that debate that saw many people come to accept or begin to accept evolution. But even so, there was still little support or enthusiasm for Darwin's mechanism of natural selection. So that's kind of looking at the major kind of events in the whole evolution of evolutionary thought. And I've included some great timelines that were constructed by other individuals to kind of map out these events in history. So I hope you enjoyed that lecture series and that it did not put you to sleep, and that you have a better understanding of how evolutionary theory as it is today came to be.